The NHS, as people who are sort of going through the process will know, has long faced challenges related to bureaucratic inefficiency, much of which is exacerbated by fragmented and outdated computer systems or conflicting computer systems that don't seem to interrelate with one another. I remember when I was in hospital last time, I received documentation which misgendered me, which I found very entertaining, but sort of symptomatic of the wider problems. Later, because the hospital didn't pay attention to what I told them about being on the haemophilia scale, because they didn't consult the one of the other hospitals which treats me, and they got drugs straight off the shelf rather than specialized drugs that I need. Sort of a week or so after my surgery, my wounds opened up and I was bleeding for about 10 days, and I was back in hospital and wasting a lot of money and feeling very worried. And in the process, my paperwork had got covered in blood, my blood, and I asked my GP for a copy of my paperwork, just so I had it on file. And what I got eventually, after 2 months of asking, was completely different documentation with completely different diagnoses. And you think, how do I trust this? It's a fragmented, it's a non-integrated system, because the NHS employs a multitude of IT systems across its various trusts and services, many of which are not interoperable, and the lack of integration leads to difficulties in sharing patient records, test results, and other critical information between different parts of the NHS. Many NHS facilities continue to rely on outdated legacy systems that are incompatible with modern software solutions, and these systems are often difficult to maintain, slow to process information, and prone to technical failures. And then there is this paternalistic approach taken by NHS by individuals within the NHS, which comes across as deeply patronising and extraordinarily defensive, and quite threatening if you're in the middle of this sort of nonsense. I went for a blood test today, a week after I had some serious symptoms, and I got to the hospital and I was told that I needed documentation that I should have printed out at home. Well, the information from the NHS direct that I'd been sent said that if I didn't have a printer, I could get it printed at reception. The reception they meant was the reception at my GP, rather than the reception at the hospital, and the hospital was quite defiant, so I didn't have the blood tests done. And I thought this was a very ambiguous piece of information. Anyway, I eventually got the documentation, and what I had been promised, of course, and now I've got the documentation in front of me, and it's deeply, it's full of acronyms, but of course I'm interested in looking at it. The reason I didn't get this piece of paper originally was because instead of being seen by a standard GP in the practice, I was seen by a locum. So the documentation I've got is now signed by one of the senior doctors in the practice, and I had been promised a blood test which would rule out or confirm that there was a possibility of cancer had returned. So I was presuming I was going to get a CEA test. In fact, what I've been sent for is an FBC test, a full blood count test, which is essentially, and it makes it very clear here in the biochemistry, ferritin. It's essentially to see whether or not I've got anemia after having been involved in some bleeding. And you just think, this is madness. There's an element of madness to this. It doesn't help that my consultant is on holiday or about to go on holiday. And it doesn't help that, I just assumed that this was something I could deal with through my GP. I don't think so. It was serious enough to merit an ambulance person coming to see me in the middle of the night last week, but not serious enough for my GP to take it any more seriously than to wonder if I've got anemia. And I suppose if I hadn't seen the documentation, I would feel I would feel sort of in the system, and I would feel as if I'm being processed, and I would feel looked after. As it is, looking at the documentation now, I feel significantly worried. The lack of standardised procedures across the different NHS trusts, the duplication of efforts, the failure of efforts, the administrative tasks such as patient registration or appointment scheduling, which might be repeated across different departments, wastes time, wastes resources. The information which is presented, the documentation that I was sent initially through the NHS Direct form, the letter was a form letter telling me about reception, and I've spoken to other GPs, and they say, oh yes, we send that out as well. So it's got nothing to do with the GP surgery. It's to do with the NHS failing to think ahead, failing to think through about, and failing to check whether or not their documentation is in any way ambiguous. It's not ambiguous to them because they see this regularly, but it is ambiguous to an ordinary individual. And to then have somebody reading it out aloud as if you're a twit is deeply patronising and deeply condescending. And there was a rather lovely nurse standing behind while I was going through all this stuff, who reached out and said, yes, it is ambiguous, and shook my hand. And I thought, thank you for that humanity, but why do we have to go through this? Because we should have a system that is coherent, and you should be able to go to a doctor and feel cared for, rather than feel increasingly alarmed and managed, processed. In some cases, the whole thing is about the healthcare professionals having to manually enter the same data in multiple systems, increasing the likelihood of errors, slowing down the process. I mean, the person who signed this document here that I've got isn't the doctor I saw, it's somebody else. And the multiple systems to complete routine tasks, this complexity is overwhelming, and it leads to confusion, to error, to failure. For example, a doctor might need to log into one system to access patient records and then into another to order tests or medication. This is nonsense. The diversity of systems in use means that staff are required to have extensive training to become proficient in every single one of these systems. Why? The user interfaces of these systems are often unintuitive. They lead to inefficiencies. They lead to error in their use. They lead to frustration among the staff. And so rarely does a patient actually get to hold some of this rubbish in their hands, and they look at it and they think, this is madness. Older systems are more susceptible to cyber attacks and data breaches, posing significant risks to patient privacy. The WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017, for example, which severely impacted the NHS, highlighted the vulnerabilities of relying on outdated IT infrastructure, and ensuring all systems are consistently updated with the latest security patches is a challenge given the diversity of the IT systems in use, further complicates the protection of sensitive patient data. The high costs of maintenance, maintaining this patchwork of this jigsaw of different systems is expensive, and NHS trusts often need to invest significant resources in keeping these systems, these outdated systems, operational, money that could be better spent on proper patient care and the reassurance that these overworked staff should be giving to patients. Instead, they're trying to battle the bureaucracy. The bureaucratic inefficiencies associated with managing multiple systems leads to a misallocation of resources, with funds being diverted to administrative functions rather than frontline healthcare systems, and then trying to mask it all with an air of authority and confidence which doesn't cut. It doesn't work. And the assumption that the patient is stupid because the patient has questioned the chaos, the bureaucratic delays, the IT inefficiencies that lead to significant delays in patient treatment. It's been a week now, in my case, with potentially serious consequences for patient outcomes. And I don't understand the fragmented nature of the NHS IT systems. It leads to gaps in patient information. It makes it difficult for healthcare providers to deliver the highest quality of care. And the attempts at modernisation, there have been several high-profile attempts to modernise NHS IT infrastructure, such as the National Programme for IT, the NPFIT, which ultimately failed to deliver its promised improvements and was abandoned at great cost. And while there are other attempts to streamline and modernise NHS IT systems, progress has been slow. Of course it has, because the staff are overworked and overstretched and exhausted by having to defend something which is indefensible. The bureaucratic chaos in the NHS and having people as CEOs of NHS trusts who are barely literate. We shouldn't be greatly surprised that documentation, that letters which are sent to patients are ambiguous or incoherent, or they're badly structured grammatically. We shouldn't be surprised, or misgendered. We shouldn't be surprised, because the people in charge can barely string a sentence together. This is about inefficiency, or it's about a lack of efficiency. It's about high cost. It's about security, and but most importantly, it's about patient care being low down on the list of the systems. But at the top of the list are the people who are in front of the patients. That is their job, to deal with the patients. And yet that background stuff, or the paddling beneath the swan, isn't there to support them. And addressing these issues requires a coordinated effort to modernise and integrate IT systems, because the more money that's thrown at the NHS, the more it goes in the hands and in the pockets of the senior bureaucrats, who are very comfortable with these incoherent systems. They see them every day. The patients barely ever see them. And yet the patients are the ones who are impacted most by this chaos. Sorry, it sounds as if this is a whinge, but I was sort of counting the hours until I had reassurance. There's going to be no reassurance from this blood test. I'm just going to find out that I'm not anemic, or I am anemic, and who cares? I was more concerned about whether or not I've got a recurrence of cancer. And this isn't going to tell me. And a week on from this little crisis, I know nothing. And even if I wait for the blood test, I'm going to know nothing. And I simply despair. And I'm sorry to make this sound so personal, but you know, it's being involved in the sort of NHS system. I feel it's sort of one instance of bureaucratic chaos after another. Bureaucracy comes from two Greek words, or it comes from one Greek word and one French word, unlike aristocracy, which is two good Greek words, or democracy, two good Greek words. Demos, people, kratos, rule. Aristo, best, kratos, rule. Bureaucracy, kratos, rule, and bureau, desk. Rule by the desk, rule by a piece of wood, rule by an inanimate object, rule by something that you cannot talk to. You just write on it. This doesn't make sense. Unless that desk is doing its job, it makes no sense at all to be ruled by something which is so inflexible and which cannot be questioned.